Have you ever felt like your whole world flipped upside down in an instant? One moment, you're so certain of who you are and what you believe, and the next, all of it starts to crumble beneath your feet. My name is Ollie Adams. I'm 59 years old, and until a few years ago, I was an Imam, a religious leader, who believed I had all the answers I needed for life. I want to share how everything changed for me. Not just a small shift, but a complete transformation that shook me to my core. It began with a medical diagnosis that I assumed was a test of my faith, but it led me to question everything I once held dear. This is my story. I grew up in a deeply religious family back in my home country of Iraq. My grandfather was an Imam, and from an early age, he was the one who taught me how to recite the Quran. I remember his weathered hands guiding mine over each line, making sure I pronounced every word perfectly. Even as a child, there was this profound sense of honor I felt when he entrusted me with God's words. By the time I was a teenager, I already knew I wanted to devote my life to my faith. Back then, I never imagined living anywhere other than Iraq. But life has a way of steering us in directions we don't expect. The political climate at home grew tense, and it felt like our entire community lived in fear. Friends of mine, also clerics, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. My wife, her name is Sarah, and I knew we couldn't stay much longer if we wanted a safe future for our children. So we packed our bags, said goodbye to our relatives, and made our way to the United States. I can still recall the mixture of hope and anxiety I felt stepping off the plane. The air smelled different, the language sounded different, and for a moment, I wondered if I had made the right choice. Yet, despite the unfamiliar surroundings, I believed with all my heart that God had a purpose for me here in America. Sarah and I worked hard to build a community, planting the seeds of a new mosque in a small neighborhood where many other immigrants had settled. Each day, I spoke with families, guided them through prayers, and assured them that staying true to our faith was our anchor in this new land. It was a challenging but rewarding life. Our mosque thrived, and I became well known for my sermons. People liked that I merged traditional teachings with a sense of practical compassion. I'd often remind them how important it is to care for one another, to offer charity, and to show kindness to strangers. For years, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I believed I was walking exactly the path God had set for me. Then, at 59 years old, I got the news: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. When the doctor told me, it was as if the ground underneath me vanished. He explained that my options were limited, that chemotherapy might grant me a bit more time, but there was no guaranteed cure. I remember trying to smile, telling him I trusted God's will. Inside, fear was ripping through me like a storm I couldn't control. I told myself this was a test, much like the trials prophets of old had faced. If I could remain steadfast, perhaps God would honor my unwavering faith. I won't lie. Chemotherapy was grueling. The sessions left me weak and nauseous, sometimes unable to eat, other times too exhausted to move. Yet I maintained my daily prayers. I would whisper Quranic verses under my breath, hoping for comfort and strength. Often, I'd feel this faint spark of hope, thinking that maybe the next session would be the one that drove the cancer out. Other times, I'd be overwhelmed by doubt, questioning why a merciful God would allow such suffering. I tried to push those thoughts away. After all, I was an Imam, and people looked to me for certainty, not doubt. One evening, after a particularly harsh round of chemo, I felt an intense pressure in my chest. I first dismissed it as a cramp or indigestion, but it got worse, to the point I couldn't breathe. Everything around me went dark, and then, in a moment that still feels impossible to describe, I found myself above my own body. I looked down and saw doctors and nurses frantically trying to revive me. It was the strangest thing. My eyes weren't open, My heart wasn't beating, but I was somehow aware of everything happening. In that suspended state, I questioned, is this death? Am I about to meet God? But before I had any answer, I noticed a bright light in the distance. It was warm, gentle, and it pulsed with an overwhelming sense of peace. As I drifted toward it, I heard familiar sounds. My mother's lullabies, the evening prayers my father used to recite, even the whispered verses of the Quran from my grandfather's study. They echoed around me, enveloping me in a cocoon of memories. In that moment, I felt a joy so profound it brought tears to my eyes. A small voice in my mind whispered, "This must be paradise." But that bliss didn't last. Almost as soon as I labeled it paradise, the serene light turned harsh, and the lush surroundings began to decay. The leaves on the trees turned black, the fruit shriveled, and a nauseating smell filled the air. A suffocating darkness rushed in. I started hearing cries, men, women, children, all screaming in torment. Among those voices, one cut the deepest. It was my mother's. She was crying out, "Have mercy! Have mercy!" The anguish in her voice shattered my heart. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and I had no sense of direction. There was no up or down, just an endless void. Then a voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the darkness. It said, "Ollie, everything will now be revealed." My eyes were drawn to a throne looming ahead. Someone sat on it, though I couldn't make out every detail in the shadows. As I approached, my legs gave out. Then I recognized him. At least, I believed I did. It looked like the Prophet Muhammad, but he was bound in chains, and his expression was filled with sorrow. It made no sense to me. Why would the Prophet be in chains? In my faith, this was unimaginable. I tried to speak, to protest, but my words came out in a frantic, desperate plea. I'm an Imam. I dedicated my life to God. I serve the mosque. Why am I seeing this? But my voice was swallowed by the darkness. Then another voice, ancient and commanding, echoed around the throne. The time has come for you to know the truth, Ali. A book crashed down from above, shaking the ground. My eyes went wide. It was the Quran, the scripture I had studied and recited my entire life. The pages began turning on their own, as if an invisible hand guided them. Again, that powerful voice asked, "Who is Allah?" Ali, have you ever truly asked yourself that question? My first thought was, of course I know. He's the creator, the most merciful. But the voice pressed on. How do you know? Have you ever thought about the origin of your beliefs? Panic lit up inside me. I had never really questioned. It had always been a given. I believed it because that was how I was raised, how everyone around me believed. For an Imam, someone who was supposed to have all the answers, the question felt like a hammer blow. Suddenly, images started to emerge from the pages of the Quran, showing me scenes from history. I saw ancient Arabs worshipping multiple gods around the Kaaba. Incense burned, people bowed to idols, chanting names like Al-Lat and Al-Uzza. The voice said, "This is the Kaaba before Islam. Where was Allah among these gods?" I felt like my mind was unraveling. I always knew about the period of ignorance before Islam, what we call Jahiliyyah, but I had never lingered on the details. The vision shifted again, taking me to a place with a massive idol called Baal, and underneath it, inscriptions that looked similar to the Arabic script I was used to. It read Baal, and right beneath it, another name, El-Baal, El-Allah. Do you see their connection? The voice intoned. My knees were shaking. Could my lifelong faith be built on something I never really understood? Just as I felt I might shatter under the weight of this revelation, the darkness vanished. I woke up in the hospital, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. Nurses were all around. Relief spread across their faces. "You're back," one said softly, and I realized they had almost lost me. But the man they saved wasn't the same man who had coded on that bed. My near-death experience lingered in my mind, haunting every moment. Scenes of decay, the bound prophet, the voice asking me questions I couldn't answer. Everything felt tainted by doubt now. Once I was stable, days turned to weeks, and I found myself unable to pray as I once did. I'd start to perform the ritual washing, and halfway through, I'd stop, overcome by a sense of uncertainty. My wife Sarah noticed my troubled state. She'd place a hand on my shoulder, her face filled with concern, but she didn't know how to reach me. After all, how could I explain to the woman who had believed in my leadership for decades that I was questioning the very foundations of our faith? At night, I often wandered our small backyard, staring at the stars, remembering the day I first led a prayer in our mosque in Iraq. I had been so confident, so certain that God spoke through the Quran, and that my role was simply to guide others in understanding it. Now, I felt like I knew nothing. Memories of my childhood, sitting in my grandfather's study, filled my mind. I could still smell the cardamom coffee he used to sip. He'd glance at me with this gentle pride, praising my memorization skills. If only he could see me now, doubting, uncertain, searching for answers I never thought to seek before. My children noticed the change in me too. My oldest son, Hassan, once asked me, "Dad, why would a merciful God let people suffer?" Back then, I answered with the usual response about God's wisdom being beyond our understanding. But now, I couldn't offer that anymore. I felt like a hypocrite. The community members who used to come to me for spiritual guidance started whispering that I was either too ill to lead or had lost my way in this foreign land. They didn't know the half of it. In my desperation, I started researching the historical context of Islam. I pored over books about ancient Semitic religions, the evolution of monotheism, and the influences that shaped the Quran's early revelations. What I found disturbed me. The lines between traditions seemed more blurred than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. There were echoes of older beliefs in our texts, subtle but unmistakable. I felt that I had, in some sense, missed a crucial piece of the puzzle. One day, feeling exhausted both physically and emotionally, I opened up to my oncologist, Dr. Murray. She was a calm presence in my life, treating me with the same compassion she showed all her patients. She told me about her own journey, growing up in a religious household, but eventually finding a faith that encouraged questions rather than silencing them. I was taken aback by her openness. She didn't push me to accept her way of thinking. She simply listened. I started spending time in the hospital chapel, not to pray in the way I used to, but to sit in the silence, letting my thoughts settle. Sometimes, I'd see Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and people of all faiths come in and out, each seeking comfort in their own way. One of the hospital's Muslim residents recognized me, approached carefully, and shared that he struggled with reconciling modern medicine and some of the teachings we grew up with. It felt oddly comforting to meet someone else on the edge of doubt. Bit by bit, I began to reflect on the possibility that my near-death experience might have been urging me to break free from the constraints of tradition and open my heart to something new. I felt drawn to read about Jesus. In Islam, we learn about Jesus as a prophet, not as the Son of God, but something about the idea of him as the way, the truth, and the life intrigued me. I had always dismissed Christian beliefs as a distortion of the original message. Now, I couldn't so easily brush it aside. Eventually, I met a chaplain named Father John. He had a gentleness about him, an unspoken empathy that made it easy to open up. One day he asked, "Ollie, have you thought about Jesus in the context of what you experienced?" I admitted I hadn't, at least not in depth. He read a verse from the Bible to me. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." I felt something stir inside me. It was like a piece of the puzzle sliding into place, though I couldn't fully understand how. In the weeks that followed, despite the fear of what my family and community would think, I delved into the Gospels. I read about Jesus' teachings of love, forgiveness, and compassion for the outcast. It was so different from the environment of strict rituals I'd known. Something about his words resonated with my deepest questions, like a voice speaking directly to my doubts and fears. One night, I found myself praying in a way I never had before. I said, "God, if you're truly there, if what I experienced was real, show me the truth. Please." I cried, letting go of the frustration and confusion that had been building up for so long. Not long after, I made the decision to be baptized. It wasn't simple or easy, but I felt a peace inside me that I'd never experienced before. The ceremony was small, just Father John, a couple of close friends, and me. As the water poured over my head, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. It was as if the crushing weight of doubt slipped off my shoulders. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew the road ahead might be complicated, especially with my family. But in that moment, I felt truly free. A few days later, I got more astonishing news. The doctors ran new tests, and there was no trace of my cancer. They couldn't explain it. They scanned, rescanned, and ran labs multiple times. They found nothing. Some called it a miracle. Others said maybe the chemotherapy had finally worked in a way they hadn't predicted. But I knew in my heart where my healing came from. My wife, Sarah, was both relieved by my recovery and puzzled by my conversion. She admitted she felt betrayed that the man she married, a devout Muslim who had led so many in prayer, had embraced a different faith. But she also saw the gentle joy and peace in my eyes, a peace she hadn't seen in me before. We had long, difficult conversations, sometimes ending in tears, sometimes in silence. But I kept telling her, I found a truth that answered questions I never dared to ask, and it brought me a peace I never knew before. I won't pretend it was smooth sailing. My children were divided. My youngest daughter, Nadia, was curious, asking me dozens of questions about Jesus. My older son, Hassan, was furious. He said I'd turned my back on everything our family stood for. The community I once led all but shut their doors to me, calling me an apostate. It hurt to lose that respect and trust, but I couldn't go back to who I was pretending to be. The strangest part, in a way, was adjusting to life outside the routines that had once defined me. I no longer called the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. I didn't spend hours each week preparing Friday sermons. Some days, I missed the sense of structure, but my new journey kept me learning and growing. I read the Bible daily, soaking in the words of Jesus. I prayed, not in Arabic, but in my own simple words, asking God to guide me forward, to use me to show love to others. Even my physical appearance changed as I recovered. I gained some weight back, my hair, thinned by chemotherapy, started to regrow, and my energy levels climbed. People who saw me couldn't believe how healthy I looked. And I told them, whenever they asked, that I believed my healing was a sign of God's grace, something that defied simple explanation. These days, my life revolves around gratitude. I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I do is thank God for another day. My faith isn't about memorizing verses or performing rituals out of habit. It's about a personal relationship with the Creator, something I never truly understood before. There's no more pretense, no more fear that I'll be punished for asking the wrong questions. And I've realized that doubts, rather than being a sign of weak faith, can be the very thing that leads us to greater understanding. I share my story now because I know there are others out there who feel trapped by religion, by tradition, by fear of disappointing their families. Some may have had experiences that made them question everything, yet they keep silent because they worry about judgment. I want you to know you're not alone. It's okay to question, to seek answers beyond what you've always known. And it's okay to let go of beliefs that no longer resonate with what your heart knows to be true. In my near-death experience, when I saw the prophet bound and heard those voices, I believe it was a powerful metaphor. It was as if the truth was bound by the chains of cultural tradition, and I was being called to look beyond the surface. I don't claim to have all the answers now, but I'm living each day in the freedom of knowing I can pursue truth without fear. The words of Jesus about love, forgiveness, and the invitation to know the Father have become my guide. Before, I used to define myself by my title, Imam Ali Adams. Now, I'm simply Ali, a husband, a father, and most of all, a servant to a loving God who gave me a second chance. When I think about how close I came to dying, it makes each moment feel incredibly precious. I may have lost my old identity and community, but I gained a sense of peace that I can't adequately put into words. If you're listening to this wondering if you're also allowed to search beyond your tradition, I want you to know that you absolutely can. God is bigger than any one set of rituals or cultural norms. It's natural to cling to what we've been taught, but it's also natural to explore, to ask questions, and to grow. If you're seeking truth sincerely, I believe you'll find it. Maybe not in the way you expect, but it will come in the way you need.